Would you join me in prayer? Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. All of us have been treated unfairly at one time or another, but few of us here have actually been persecuted. There have been occasions when all of us have felt mistreated by individuals, by businesses, by institutions, even by government agencies, but persecution involves systematic mistreatment. If we look back far enough, most of our ancestors came to this country to escape persecution. My mother's ancestors, the Savages, were Huguenots, French Protestants who were persecuted for their harsh criticisms of Catholic doctrine and worship practices. But I've been preaching for 34 years and I've never been persecuted for my religious convictions. I've had people disagree with, even take offense at things that I've said from the pulpit, but I've never been systematically mistreated because of my religious beliefs. My father's ancestors, the Otts, were part of that first large wave of German immigrants that came to America because of the persecutions they endured during the 30 Years' War and the devastating impact that it had in Central Europe in the early part of the 17th century. But today we've got army units rolling into town regularly to practice maneuvers at Fort Custer, and I've never, ever felt threatened seeing their convoys rolling into town. Most of our ancestors came to America to escape the systematic mistreatment that they endured in their ancestral homelands, where they had property confiscated by marauding bands of soldiers. They endured regime changes that resulted in hostile rulers coming into power and passing new laws undermining their civic rights. They saw their livelihoods threatened by economies devastated by war. They saw their health jeopardized by the plague of diseases that spread through their impoverished neighborhoods. America provided the hope of a better life for our persecuted ancestors, and we are the beneficiaries of that hope. We who trace our roots to the devastations of our European ancestors have inherited a life free of persecution. We all get mistreated from time to time. People say and do things that aren't fair, but most of us have never been subjected to systematic mistreatment here in America. Yet ironically, we who trace our European histories back to ancestors who came to America seeking freedom from persecution have become the persecutors. All throughout our nation's history, we've persecuted and today continue to persecute African Americans. For 200 years, we brutalized them with chattel slavery, generating wealth by compelling them to labor without compensation, tearing their families apart, depriving them of marital rights, trading and selling them as property. After slavery, we persecuted them with Jim Crow laws, Klan beatings, mob lynchings that kept them segregated and excluded and impoverished and terrorized. After World War II, we redlined them out of our white neighborhoods by denying their applications for FHA-backed loans that our parents and our grandparents used to buy homes with low down payments and mortgages amortized over 30 years to make home owning affordable to middle-class white Americans. Since the 70s, we've been persecuting them by declaring a war on drugs, which for all intents and purposes become a war on young African American men. Even though study after study indicates that people of all races use and sell illicit drugs at the same rates, 3/4 of all people imprisoned for drug offenses are black or Latino, 3/4. "50 years ago, on this weekend, hundreds of peaceful demonstrators were brutally attacked with billy clubs, cattle prods, horse whips, and clouds of tear gas by Alabama State police officers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma on a day that's become known as Bloody Sunday. Many of us are probably familiar with the story of Reverend James Reeb, a 38-year-old white Unitarian Universalist minister from Boston, Massachusetts, who was among the hundreds of clergymen from across the country who heeded Martin Luther King Jr.'s call to come to Selma for a second march in the wake of Bloody Sunday. On March 9th, 1965, Reeb, a father of four, and two other Unitarian Universalist ministers were walking back to Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma after eating dinner at Walker's Cafe when a group of four white men approached them from behind and beat them. Reeb was struck in the head with a club and died on March 11th in a Birmingham hospital. President Lyndon Johnson sent a bouquet of yellow roses to his hospital room, made a personal sympathy call to his family after he died, and referenced him as a man of God in a nationally televised speech before a joint session of Congress on March 15th when he introduced the Voting Rights Act. But there were no calls from the White House to the family of the first martyr of Bloody Sunday. No national attention was given to the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson. He was a 27-year-old African American who was shot and killed by an Alabama state trooper while participating in a peaceful march in Marion, Alabama, 20 miles west of Selma. Jimmy Lee Jackson was an Army veteran, a father of a young daughter, a deacon at St. James Baptist Church, who, after returning from Vietnam, was denied the right to vote on multiple occasions and had become active in the voter registration initiatives in Perry County. On February 18th, a group of some 200 protesters were participating in a peaceful evening march when they were attacked by Marion police officers and Perry County sheriff's deputies and Alabama state troopers. Jackson and other marchers sought refuge in Mac's Cafe along with Jackson's mother, Viola Jackson, and his 82-year-old grandfather. Witnesses say the troopers entered the restaurant and began beating those inside. Jackson was shot in the stomach with a shotgun at close range by an Alabama state trooper as he tried to protect his family. It was Jackson's death that led civil rights leaders to call for the voting rights march from Selma to Montgomery. 45 years later, in 2010, former state trooper James Fowler, who was then 77 years old, pleaded guilty to a single charge of manslaughter in Jackson's death and served 5 months in prison. This weekend, forums and workshops, appearances by celebrities, speeches by political leaders, including President Barack Obama, are taking place in Selma to celebrate the impact of that momentous day and to refocus the public's attention on racial injustices that persist today. 50 years after that famous march, 40% of the population in Selma lives in poverty. Unemployment rates are twice the state average. The country club in a county that's 80% black still does not have a single white member. Selma public schools have been effectively segregated since the early 1900s, with black students making up 99% of the student body. Almost all white kids go to private schools. In 2000, a new monument was unveiled in a public park in Selma honoring Nathan Bedford Forrest, Confederate general who went on to become the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. 2000. As plans were being finalized for this weekend celebration, the Justice Department released the findings of their investigation into racial injustices in Ferguson, Missouri. No charges will be brought against the white officer who shot and killed Michael Brown, but the Justice Department released a 102-page report detailing systemic race discrimination and abuses of power. According to their findings, African Americans, who make up 67% of Ferguson's population, were involved in 93% of the arrests, 85% of all traffic stops, and received 90% of the tickets issued by officers between 2012 and 2014. But in spite of the public demonstrations, in spite of the Justice Department's 102-page report, the city's mayor, James Knowles III, gave a speech on Friday indicating that he remains unconvinced that widespread problems exist. Recently, the Battle Creek Inquirer ran a front-page story showing that African American students in all 4 of our local school districts are disciplined at a higher rate than white students. It isn't a Southern problem. It isn't a poverty problem. It's a race problem. It isn't something we like being reminded of, but it's true. We have systematically mistreated African American people ever since the days of our nation's founding, we, descendants of the persecuted, have become the persecutors. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Persecution is systematic mistreatment. Jesus was persecuted by the religious elite of his day, by the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes of the temple, who felt threatened by his growing popularity and were stung by the harsh critique of their hypocrisy. They harassed him. They challenged his authority. They spread false rumors about him. They bribed one of his followers to betray him. They arrested him for heresy. They beat him. They turned him over to the Roman governor to have him crucified. The cross and the lynching tree are both symbols of persecution. Last week we talked about the two great spiritual awakenings that are at the heart of every world religion. The first is the personal awakening, the claiming of our true identity as God's beloved sons and daughters. The second is a social awakening, the realization that not just I, but all people everywhere are also God's beloved children, that we have all been formed from the same sacred dust of the earth, that we are all spiritual siblings. We said that peacemakers are people who have experienced these two great spiritual awakenings. They know that they are precious in the eyes of God, and they recognize every other human being as siblings. Even when people behave badly, peacemakers treat them with dignity and respect because they still recognize them as God's beloved sons and daughters. Persecution is the opposite of peacemaking. Peacemaking requires our ability to recognize that our lives are connected, that our welfares are linked, that we share a common ancestry. Persecution requires our willingness to strip people of their humanity, to define them as other, to reject our common birthright as beloved sons and daughters of God. Sometimes it seems as though the only way we can feel good about ourselves is by having someone beneath us, someone we can look down on, someone we can feel justified mistreating. But remember what we said a few weeks ago when we talked about the beatitude of Jesus that blessed those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Righteousness isn't conforming to some external set of rules or laws or commandments. Biblical righteousness is always relational. It's about right-usness. That's our highest spiritual calling. Blessed are those who endure persecution, seeking right-usness for everyone. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Amen.